When I was young, about 11 or 12, my parents took me and my twin brother on a trip across the United States. We were to visit many national and state parks along the way, but the entire trip was to be done in a truck. This was difficult for us, as we were young and very prone to boredom and agitation. Both things multiple 13-hour car rides would certainly not help. To rectify this, my mother rented an audiobook for us to listen from the library. I had listened to vinyl and cassette audiobooks before, and the CD was an exciting evolution that we looked forward to. As we started the trip, she popped in the first story, a book called Boy by Roald Dahl. To my horror, I quickly realized that this was not what I had come to expect from Dahl's work. This was no Big Friendly Giant or James and the Giant Peach. Boy was his autobiography. Quietly, I rolled my eyes, resigning myself to listen to 20 or so hours of nonfiction, but as the day passed on, I found myself actually interested in what he had to say. Dahl was never one for introductions or forewords, but before the first chapter of this book, he had written this. An autobiography is a book a person writes about his own life, and it is usually full of all sorts of boring details. This is not an autobiography. I would never write a history of myself. On the other hand, throughout my young days at school and just afterwards, a number of things happened to me that I have never forgotten. None of these things is important, but each of them made such a tremendous impression on me that I have never been able to get them out of my mind. Each of them, even after a lapse of 50 and sometimes 60 years, has remained seared on my memory. I didn't have to search for any of them. All I had to do was skim them off the top of my consciousness and write them down. Some are funny. Some are painful. Some are unpleasant. I suppose that is why I've always remembered them so vividly. All are true. To this day, I still vividly remember listening to a passage where Dahl described an event very early in his life. It was summertime, and he was walking down a hill on some errand when he saw a boy rocketing down the hill on a bike. As he watched the boy fly past him, he realized that the boy was pedaling backwards as he rode, and wasn't even holding the handlebars. Astonished by the encounter in his young life, Dahl ends the episode by saying that the thing that stood out the most in his mind was that if you were to ask him, at that moment, what he would want to be in life, he would have said that boy on that bike. This struck a young me very powerfully, and I remember thinking, hey, I've thought that before, to myself as the plains of the Pacific Northwest flashed by our car window. This was my first positive interaction with a nonfiction piece of work, as most of my experience was with school textbooks and boring coffee table novelties. It was also the first biography I have ever finished, and it would be over a decade until I experienced my second. While studying literature in school, I heard about a massive book that sat at the top of the pseudo-autobiographical throne, a massive text that almost no professor would assign, and which no one had actually read. The author, an obscure Frenchman of brilliant but distant style, was said to have written it over 13 years. Remembrance of Things Past, or more accurately, In Search of Lost Time, depending upon your translation, is a book of over 1.2 million words, over 3,000 pages. Its author, Marcel Proust, is one of those authors that you hear about through the grapevine, but never really encounter in your day-to-day life. Even people who enjoy reading books often skip over the novel for its length and form, as it is generally accepted to be part of the stream of consciousness style, which people often find difficult to understand. It does not help that In Search of Lost Time is Proust's only major work, as most of his publications are magazine pieces or literary critiques. After its initial publication in 1913, it was decided that the novel would be mercifully split into 7 volumes, each of which split into smaller sections. This is, of course, an oversimplification of why not many people read In Search of Lost Time, but the core elements of these repulsive qualities were what pushed me away from it too, initially. 2 years later, I found a beautifully bound book in a secondhand bookstore that I had never heard of before. The title was Swan's Way, and was apparently written by Proust, as the cover said. I bought it and brought it home. The book was only about 400 pages long, and after finishing a couple other projects, I started reading through it. It was a beautiful novel. The prose and style were clear and whimsical. The characters talked and acted so realistically that I found myself thinking that I had met them before, or at least remembered people that acted just like them. The narrator, a boy at the beginning, has such a strong and loving relationship with his mother that I found myself thinking that I had written the passages at times. I had felt almost exactly the same in my childhood, but it was so long ago that I had almost forgotten it. And, near the end of my reading, I found myself remembering that time in the car, as we drove for days over the stretching Midwest plains toward Yellowstone, listening to Roald Dahl relate the childhood memories that he could recall. After finishing it, I looked up a description of Swan's Way, and to my great surprise I found that Swan's Way was actually the first volume of Proust's masterwork. This whole time I had been reading In Search of Lost Time already. 2 months later, I was discussing the book with my parents, who had never heard of the book before, but the very next day they came home from a thrift shop with the complete set of The Search they had found in a dusty old glass cabinet. I immediately bought it from them. It is an intimidating thing, isn't it? But if I have learned anything from reading Proust, it is that the entirety of his work is folded and repeated in every little detail of those 3,000 pages. You do not need to read every letter of In Search of Lost Time to feel how Proust wants you to feel. Swan's Way is as complete and interesting a novel as the work it is the first part of, and each page is equally as interesting and worthy of your attention as the whole novel. Because of this, you can really open up the book to any page and start reading. All in all, The Search is about remembering what made us happy. It is about a life, Proust's life specifically, but it is also about how flashes of halcyon memory bring us back to that life, how things later on gently, or surprisingly, rip us back into the past. That is a valuable thing to feel, and the book deserves to be read by more people. Proust spends the majority of the novel trying to find what he is meant to do. First, he tries becoming a member of the elect, of the elite, but realizes that these people, these dukes and duchesses, are just sad people too, and that their follies do nothing to separate them from the rest of humanity. Next, he tries love. He spends hundreds of pages on individual women he has fallen in love with, only to find that this, too, is unfulfilling. There is something there, some barrier to knowing that he cannot get past. He remains apart, even from those he loves. Finally, after thousands of pages and decades of both bitter and sweet, he catches a smell, a taste of a French treat called a madeleine, and then writes this: "When, from a long distant past nothing subsists, after the people are dead, after the things are broken and scattered, still, alone, more fragile, but with more vitality, more unsubstantial, more persistent, more fateful, the smell and taste of things remain poised a long time, like souls, ready to remind us, waiting and hoping for their moment amid the ruins of all the rest, and bear unfaltering, in the tiny and almost impalpable drop of their essence, the vast structure of recollection." And once again I had recognized the taste of the crumb of madeleine soaked in her decoction of lime flowers, which my aunt used to give me, although I did not yet know, and must long postpone the discovery of why this memory made me so happy. Immediately the old grey house upon the street, where her room was, rose up like the scenery of a theater. He realizes, after all the years, after all the successes and failures, and after all the disappointments he has experienced, that he is strangely fulfilled by a recursion, a regression of perspective. He is pulled back in time by the smell of the tea and the taste of the madeleine, and realizes that the years were necessary. It takes a lifetime to create enough memories to be pulled back by. He understands that every folly, every horrid mistake he has ever made has affected him, and created a contained mental pool of emotion laying dormant in his mind until it is awakened again. The ending of this quote, the reference to a theater, is not an accident. No word out of the 1.2 million is. Proust, after all this failure and embarrassment and love and society, knows that from the position of the past, from the perspective of the memory, his life is not boring or sad. It is exciting. It is expressive and fascinating and beautiful. And what's more, he is not the only one who can access that pool of memory and emotion. he can share that power with others. Just like the smell of a well-made pastry can bring him to such a happy place, his writing can do that for others. He can share his nostalgia, his specific memories, with us. And that, to Proust, is art. All art, writing, painting, cooking, all of it is a conduit by which the artist can give that power of recollection, that ripping back into memory, to others, even people who are not even born yet. He wants to give you that smell of tea, that taste of Madeline, and to pull you back into your own pool of emotion that you might have forgotten about. I thought nothing at all, but I felt an immense sadness as when two parts of one's past existence, which have been anchored near to one, and upon which one has perhaps been basing idly from day to day an unacknowledged hope, remove themselves, finally, with a joyous flapping of pennants for unknown destinations, like a pair of ships. The writing of oneself, the autobiography, is a reach back into the memory, but it is also a clawing forward, a letter sent to us, the people who outlive him, and it is that dichotomy, that push and pull of our own personal history as it shimmers and matches with his, that the power of the art becomes real. I would call this a kind of love, the connection he has created with the infinite future of readers before him, but Proust would disagree. To him, art transcends love. Art is more than the humans who make it. Art is a purpose. It is enough, just like it was enough for us as children. What we feel is the only thing that exists for us, and we project it into the past, into the future, without letting ourselves be stopped by the fictitious barriers of death. Just like I said before, you do not need to read the entirety of In Search of Lost Time to feel its message. It itself is a life, and purpose is not created by following a life to its end and making a final verdict. It is found in the pools of our memory, in the emotions of our past, present, and future, and in the ways that we share those emotions with people we will never meet. In fact, this revelation, the power of recollection, exists from the very first line of the book. For a long time, I used to go to bed early. It doesn't sound like that to us, though, does it? Every time I read that line, I can't help but hear, for a long time, we used to go to bed early. Don't you remember?